Build your better breakfast at Subway with the tasty 250 combo, a 16-ounce cup of freshly brewed Seattle's best coffee, and any delicious egg muffin melt. And don't hit the snooze on this deal. Right now, come in before 11 a.m. for a $5 footlong breakfast sub. Subway, eat fresh. The BS Report is a free-flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature subjects.
First of all,
this is the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
It might be cool, I don't know. And if it's not, I don't care.
The BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Bill Simmons works for ESPN. He's also named the sports guy, and he writes a comical sports column. He must be a popular dude.
The BS Report.
It's got a real dirty sound, like a rusty steak knife cutting through a well-aged steak.
Now.
Here's Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the BS Report. Taping this on a Tuesday. It's going to run Wednesday from the New York Times. Noted TV critic and the author of one of my favorite Hollywood books ever, The Late Shift. He has a new book that's out right now, The War of Late Night, which cannot be found anywhere in Hollywood. It's amazing. Bill Carter, you're on the Subway Fresh Take Hotline. What's happening?
Hi, I didn't know, but you couldn't find the book. That's not too good news.
I finished like half of it, and then I could not find it. And I wanted to read the whole thing before we did the podcast. I actually went out, could not find the book. The Grove didn't have it. I started calling bookstores around. They were like, oh, yeah. I mean, I guess it's probably a Hollywood thing. You probably have every Hollywood executive that wants to read this thing, right?
Well, that seems to be the case, because I've heard from a lot of them and a lot of agents. A lot of agents are reading it.
Just a little background. You did The Late Shift, which was a book about when David Letterman ended up switching from NBC to CBS because Jay Leno stole his job. And this was turned into a TV movie that I thought was one of the most underrated TV movies of that entire decade. Were you happy with the TV movie?
Well, Bill, I wrote the script, so
okay.
I was pretty happy with it, yeah.
Happy with the acting, everything?
Well, I was not particularly happy with the Leno guy. I mean, I thought the Letterman guy was really good.
He was.
But I thought the Leno guy didn't quite nail it. But Kathy Bates as his agent was astonishingly good.
Yeah. It's a great movie, and I don't know why HBO never shows it, but I watch it every time it comes on. Now, the parallel, I guess, between what happened in the book that just came out that you wrote with that book is that Leno somehow has blood on his hands. And in The Late Shift, if you really know the story, his manager, who is now deceased, was kind of pulling a lot of that crap. And I don't know, it's unclear how much Leno knew was going on and what she was doing, but this time around, it really doesn't seem like he was the one responsible. It was really NBC, right?
Yes, it really was NBC. I mean, if you wanted to make the case for Jay, you can make a case because he was, going along, winning the ratings consistently. And Conan's got, the high-powered agents now, and they were the ones talking to NBC and saying, if you don't give this guy a deal and guarantee him the Tonight Show, he's going somewhere else. So they made, the moves they needed to make, and I don't blame them. That's their job, by the way. But they forced this issue where, Jay was told he was going to be out in 5 years, and Conan was guaranteed the show. And, Jay was the one devastated at that point because he didn't think he'd done anything to merit being fired, as he saw it, in 5 years. Now, later on, what the case Conan makes is that, Jay hands him the show and tells him, that's it, I'm stepping away, goodbye, buddies, good luck. And instead, he doesn't step away. First, he takes a 10 o'clock show, which still puts him ahead of Conan. And then when they have this big, gigantic blow-up last January, and they offer the 11:30 back to Jay, he takes it. Now, I don't know who in show business can really hold that against Leno. I mean, if they offered it to him, should he have said no? I mean, I do think that's what, Conan's supporters say. He should have refused and said, no, I'm not taking the show away from Conan. But in show business, when someone offers you a job, you usually take it.
So Leno, they offered, he was on his way out. They offered him the 10 o'clock show. He took it. Then the 10 o'clock show wasn't doing well. They had a meeting with him, which you described in detail in the book, that, we're getting rid of the 10 o'clock show. Our affiliates are going crazy. They're going to end up trumping that show with their own programming if we don't get rid of it. But as an olive branch, we want to give you the 11:30 show. He after a day accepted that. He never really demanded, I want this, I want that. So it's really hard to say that there's blood on his hands. The only thing that I was against Why didn't he just leave? You know, if he was that unhappy with NBC from the get-go, why not just go to ABC at 11:30?
Yeah. Well, that's a fair question. I mean, you know, I think he was down the road pretty far with ABC because he was already, having discussions with our friend Jimmy Kimmel,
right,
about moving Jimmy to 12:30. So he was way down the road with ABC, and NBC was running all these ideas by him, most of which were ridiculous. You know, let's do a Saturday Night Live style show on Sunday night once a week. You know, Jay doesn't want to work once a week, so. You know, they proposed this 10 o'clock show where he was putting a lot of his career at risk. I mean, you know, it really was a bad idea. But I think he says he didn't want to leave because he thought, you know, when you leave, then everybody tells stories about you, about what a bad guy you are and all this. And you know, he's an incredible creature of habit. Even though the 10 o'clock show changed, he wanted to stay on the same lot so he could drive the same way. He's a really serious creature of habit.
So you almost think it's like an OCD thing.
It kind of is, and you know there are people that say that about Jay. That's really he is an awfully compulsive character. I mean, think about this guy. He does 48 weeks a year of the Tonight Show, 5 nights a week. Then he does stand-up gigs, 180 dates a year.
Yep.
I mean, this guy is crazy, mad, driven guy. And, you know, 3 nights a week he would leave the Tonight Show and fly to Vegas and perform and then come back and write his monologue for the next night.
And then he also does that Sunday night thing in Hermosa Beach, right?
Exactly. He is just an amazing glutton for this kind of work.
Hey, I like to call myself the VP of common sense with things. The common sense move just would have been to go to ABC and kill Conan, which he would have.
Yeah, and that's how you exact your revenge. You know, okay, you want to give the show to this guy? I'll go over there and beat his brains in. And everybody thought that's what he would do. That was the general feeling. He's going to go over there. He's going to beat their brains in. And yet he wound up staying at NBC and being the loyal soldier, and which is what another role he likes to play. He likes to have that, you know, description of himself.
What were his options after NBC decided to pull the 10 o'clock? Explain to the audience what the pay or play language is in a contract.
Okay, so they gave him a very unusual contract. Normally in Hollywood, the deal you get is called pay or play. And so it means that if they decide to not put your show on the air because they cancel it, they owe you money. They have to pay you off. But in this case, they had a pay and play deal, meaning they had to pay him and keep it on the air. They were like committed for 2 years to run his show by contract. And what it means is when they came to the point where they were going to cancel him, he could have said, no, you can't cancel me, you must keep me on the air. The contract says that, or I can seek an injunction, which I don't know if he would have gotten, but he certainly could have taken him to court and taken him to the cleaners because he had this guarantee. Now, they probably knew that Jay Leno would never do that because then he'd be off television for a long, long time, and that's what he lives for. But they took a gigantic risk giving him this very unusual contract.
And at that point, even if he said, all right, fine, well, why don't I leave the network then? He didn't have the same leverage he would have had with ABC 9 months before. No, that's a
very good point. The window of opportunity for him to create a show at ABC was probably gone because, you know, he's now been on 10 o'clock and he's not done well.
Right.
He's actually flopped there, so his value has greatly diminished. Now, one ABC executive did say to me, no, we would have looked at him again. We would have given him another look. But I don't think he would have gone to the Fox network. He would have been all wrong for them. So his options had greatly narrowed.
ABC made a lot of sense for him because of the type of programming they have. I mean, I would say that the programming is geared a little bit more toward women and maybe a little bit of an older audience. I don't know. It just seems like a better fit than NBC probably would have been at 11:30.
Well, at this point, it's certainly a better fit because NBC's primetime is just terrible.
Right.
And if NBC still stands for anything, they have a few comedies that still are in the NBC sort of mold. They're kind of young and hip, and that's not Jay at all. That's just he doesn't fit that at all. But he also was still sort of seduced by the notion of the Tonight Show, which forever has been this goal in the mist for every comedy guy in Hollywood that they want to be the host of the Tonight Show. But it really was only because, Carson made it this great big show. But as Jerry Seinfeld says at the end of my book,
yep.
If you think about it, nobody ever says, I'm going to go do the Tonight Show or I'm going to go do Late Show. They say, I'm going to do Letterman or I'm going to do Leno. It's the guy that makes the show, not the name.
The Seinfeld interview was really interesting. Were you surprised that he was that candid?
Well, I know Jerry, and he has become more so as time's gone on. Talk about a guy who's got all the money he'll ever need. He was surprisingly. It's surprising that he was that open about saying basically Conan made a big mistake, because his general point was, not only are you making too much of the fact that the Tonight Show is an institution, but also in show business you never leave. Don't leave the stage. Don't walk off. That's the big mistake. Always show up. Always show up. Never give up your spot. And he was giving up a spot for, at that point, no guarantee that he'd ever find another job.
And he just thought he should have just gone to 12:05 and been happy there.
Well, he thought if he stayed at 12:05, he said, just hang around. You don't know what's going to happen. Hang around. And it is interesting that since Jay's been back, he has not been doing as well. He was beaten by Letterman a week ago. He's not the invincible Jay that he used to be. And certainly there's a chance that somebody would have said, well, let's leave this in place for a year or so, but then we might as well put Conan back because this has no future. His audience is much, much, much older. The median age for Conan's audience when he left The Tonight Show was 36, and within 2 weeks, Jay had moved it to 56.
Yeah.
So, there's not a lot of future there, and you could probably say, well, Conan might have a big audience, but at least it's young, and it can grow, and he might have gotten a shot. Now, the downside to that is, if he'd stayed at 12:05 and Jay had come on and done poorly, then he'd be following Jay again, getting a bad lead-in, which is what he complained about before.
Yeah.
Possibly really damaging himself.
It's funny, this concept of the Tonight Show as an institution. It reminds me a little bit of in sports. Anybody like basically over 35, 40 years old feels like Notre Dame is more important than it is. And the reality is, to people under 30, nobody gives a crap about Notre Dame. They care about the schools that have been good in the last 10 years. And it's funny that you wrote these two books that I think, when did The Late Shift come out? In 1993?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it was the same issue in each book, is that somebody kind of overrated The Tonight Show as the institution. First, it was Letterman, who just couldn't get over the fact that, even it was CBS, they loved him. It was the same time slot. He just couldn't get past the Tonight Show thing. Same thing with Conan, right?
Well, at least with Dave, it was still connected to Johnny. I mean, he was, he
right.
would have been the successor to Johnny. He was closer.
Well, but Leno was in there though. I mean, he was the successor to Leno.
Year, yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, Dave first felt it when they gave the show to Leno. It was when he first got upset and he tried to pull some sort of a stunt to get the show, but because he did feel like he was passed over. In fact, he still makes the joke every Passover. You know, Passover is a Jewish holiday, and it's also what happened to me at NBC. He does it every year. So it's interesting to point out that, because the scar for Dave is still there.
20 years later, yeah.
And he's still complaining about the fact that he didn't get the Tonight Show.
And he's never really been the same, right?
Well, I think Dave was great when he first went to CBS.
I'm not talking about from a show standpoint. I just, mentally, it just seems like he's kind of gone off the deep end.
Yes, he went off the deep end, but, he has tons of demons. I'm not saying he wouldn't have gone off the deep end anyway. And frankly, in retrospect, one of the things that NBC said about Dave, and the reason they didn't want to give him the show, has pretty much panned out, which is that he doesn't want to do anything extra. And that means, talk to affiliates, come to upfronts, talk to advertisers, do what the network needs in terms of booking a star, things like that. Dave doesn't do any of that, and he also kind of his energy level is way down. He doesn't really do a lot of the creative stuff he did before. So I think they probably got that part of Dave right.
Right. And, I think you look at the first 18 months or so that he had at CBS after he switched over, and the big criticism on him was, could he alter his style from 12:30 to 11:30, and did it. And those shows were great. And it was almost like once Leno started beating him in the ratings just by kind of out-hustling him with affiliates and ripping off the stuff Dave was doing and appealing to the lowest common denominator, it seemed like Dave just kind of got depressed by it. Is that fair?
That's true. I think he could never believe that Jay, who he did not respect as a creative comedy guy, he always respected him as a stand-up. He thought he was a great stand-up. But he thought he was kind of old hat, that he was being beaten by this guy. I think it became sort of a constant gnawing issue for him, and yet to do the things that it would take to beat him, I mean, frankly, Bill, he's not even doing them now. I mean, because Jay is very vulnerable now, very vulnerable. The NBC network is very weak. He's been damaged by that 10 o'clock thing. And it looks like if Dave lifted his finger to work a little harder, he could beat this guy like a drum. I use this example in the book, but, Dave has never done 5 original shows. He tapes 2 in one day.
Yep.
And for years and years and years, he taped the Friday show as a second show on Thursday. And then, I don't know when it was 3 or 5 years ago, he started taping the Friday show on Monday. So he tapes 2 shows on Monday. So the Friday show comes on. It's 4 days old already. And so he can't do any topical references at all. He can't mention anybody's name because the person could have been killed in the interim. He can't do anything based on what's in the news because it'll be old news. And the audience is abandoning him on Friday because they can tell it's a canned show.
Yeah.
And it's an example of Dave just not wanting to do put in the effort that it would take to beat Jay, and it wouldn't take that much now.
You've done a nice job over the last 2 decades of somehow staying on good terms with everybody. In the book, I thought I was almost a little surprised how hard you were on Letterman. Do you have any regrets, or was that a conscious decision, or how did that play out?
I mean, I'm unabashedly a fan of Letterman's. I think he's a genius, but I also think he has sort of set this up in his own way to not be as successful as he could be, and he's making a tremendous amount of money, and he doesn't seem to be really fully putting in the effort behind it. And also, I've just heard a lot of stories about him from people that work on the show. He's a difficult guy to work for. I mean, on the one hand, they all respect him enormously, but he's really gotten more so, which for him means very socially awkward. He doesn't converse with people very easily. He doesn't do any press at all. I mean, in the years since I wrote the book, and I had a very good relationship with Dave during that book, very good. There have been numerous occasions where I thought, well, it's now his 10th year on the show. Maybe he'd do some kind of a piece about that, or it's his 20th year in late night, or anything. But he just closed himself up. And look, I'm not saying he should give me interviews. I'm just saying it made me think about him more, and how his own way of leading a show is not exactly admirable always, and sometimes just makes people crazy. I mean, he'd go 6 months without talking to his executive producer.
Right.
I mean, it's crazy things like that. And
I love the guy.
He's a great talent, but
I love the guy, and he's one of my heroes. But I even thought you could have gone further in the book. Because
you mean in criticizing him?
Yeah, I do. I just, as you said, Leno's right there to be taken. And to me, Dave, as somebody who's spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about this guy over the last 3 decades, I don't think he wants to do his show anymore. And I think he does the show because he can't imagine his life without doing the show. I mean, I even think you said in your last book, like, the only hour out of the 24 that he's happy is when he does the show.
Yeah, I think that's still true, although he certainly gets some joy out of his son.
Yeah, that's the reason.
You're right in a way. He doesn't really want to do the show, but he doesn't really want to not do the show, because he knows, and people have told me, that he watched Johnny when Johnny stepped away from the show. And boy, he just was at sea. He didn't know what to do with himself. And, that's why he was sending jokes into Dave. Johnny was writing jokes for Dave.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think that was the biggest influence on him. Because it wasn't just that Johnny didn't know what to do next, but Johnny just kind of disappeared. Nobody was talking about him anymore. And I think, Dave, even though he disguises it, I think he's got to have a pretty big ego.
He's got an enormous ego.
The thought of disappearing, I don't think is appealing.
I do think he does like the actual act of doing the show still. I mean, I've talked to some of the people on the show, and he will get up if someone comes up with a really good idea for the show, that does still excite him a bit.
Yeah.
But look at his show now. He does a longer monologue, right? And then in the second act, he does nothing anymore. He just sits at the desk and just riffs. And he's a genius, so a lot of nights it's funny, but he's not really doing anything. He's not putting in any effort. Listen, he doesn't go to rehearsal anymore.
He
doesn't rehearse the show.
I don't think he has a head writer meeting every day either.
No, I think he just meets with the producer.
Yeah.
He really has cut it way, 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 way back. And look, God love him, he's 63 years old. He's had a heart problem. Maybe he doesn't want to work that hard. A lot of people around him say, look, he knows his energy level, and this is what he can do. And so there are still people willing to watch it. You know, he's not totally lost his audience. But I do think he's at a point where I would not be surprised if he just one day didn't show up and said, I'm finished. I can't do it anymore.
And he's one of those guys that when he's done, he'll be done that day. And it won't be one of those, hey, 9 months from now will be my last show. Let's have a 9-month lead up to it.
I think so. And the question then becomes, what do you do? Because I think these shows have become real economic issues for the networks where they were, great profit centers in the past, and they're just not. The ratings aren't good enough. They're much more expensive in terms of spending for a band and, all those writers and segment producers and costume departments and all the things they have that, Jon Stewart doesn't have that. He doesn't need that. And he's still successful enough to host the Oscars. Right.
What do you think 1983 Letterman would think about 2010 Letterman show?
I think he'd think this guy's past his prime for sure.
Yeah,
not doing anything creative, not doing anything innovative, not changing the medium the way he wanted to do it in 1983.
The problem is that Letterman's best show is still better than anybody else's best show.
No, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about who has the most talent. I mean, I've talked this over with my son, who's a big Conan guy.
Yeah.
And I thought, I like Conan. Look, I think he's a talented guy. But he's not. He can't hold a candle in raw talent to Letterman. Raw talent, the guy is just off the chart, and he always had that and made his show, quantumly better than it should have been. And some nights when he didn't have great material, but I think it's not there every night anymore. It's like a guy who, like a pitcher who, once in a while he pitches and he has his good stuff, and the rest of the time he doesn't.
You brought up the changing landscape in late night. I think this is fascinating, and I think about this a lot, obviously, because one of my friends hosts a late night show. It just feels like there's two problems here, in my opinion. First is that there's so many options now, and there's so many channels, and there's so many niche shows that it's really hard for a show to kind of rise above that and grab all these different audiences. You almost have to do what Jon Stewart does, which is just attack a specific niche. And then the second issue is that if you happen to miss a show that night, you can catch up on the YouTube clip the next day. If something major happens, I'm going to see it. Like the Conan thing last night, which I thought was really funny, the Sonny Corleone. I could just see that the next day. I didn't have to watch his show that night. And it just feels to me like none of these shows have that day-to-day urgency, because if you miss something great, you're going to see it anyway.
Exactly. That's a huge problem for these shows. And I know Kimmel has sort of speculated they should stop sending the clips out because it's destroying their ratings. But the problem really is there's another aspect of it, which is that people who DVR shows now very habitually watch them in the late night hours. So that's another bit of competition that's really hurting them. And it's the same thing. It works the same way because I can replay whatever it is I wanted to watch at 9 o'clock, The Office, let's say, and I replay it at 11:30, thinking to myself, well, I can watch Dave's on whatever he does. I can watch on clips, so I don't have to watch him. I'll rewatch something at 11:30. Yeah, it's a formula for making these shows irrelevant, and there are several producers and ex-producers who've talked to me about this and think that the late night shows, we know it is over. It's just over. It can't be compelling on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's absolutely essential because it can be done on the cheap. If you really want to do it in a narrow way, you can do like a version of the Regis show.
Yep.
Just have a guy come out and riff for half an hour. Bring on a guest.
Right, and it almost seems like it could go one in two directions, because you look at the Stewart Colbert model, and it's a half hour. It's 22 minutes basically with 8 minutes of commercials. They come out, they do one act, they do a second, like some sort of remote segment, they have a guest, they're done. And it always leaves you wanting a little bit more. But the late night shows are basically structured the same way, except they pack everything in the first half hour, and then they make up for it in the second half. That's where they load the commercials. So there's really no real reason to watch the second half hour of any late night show. No. And I don't know how they fix that other than to make all these shows either 30 minutes or 45 minutes.
Well, there's another formula which I know has been proposed on occasion, which is to make them go back and make them 90 minutes.
To go longer, right. Right.
Because if you made it 90 minutes and you eliminated the second show, so you only had Dave, you didn't have Craig Ferguson, then the show would make economic sense again because you're only paying one staff.
Yeah.
And you're getting 90 minutes out of it. He would then have to do something in the second half of the show to make you watch it. They'd have to be a whole second comedy act later in the show. But, you could add a few writers from the second comedy show that's been canceled and create something in the second act, and you'd probably have, a decent rating and for a lot less money. I wouldn't be surprised to see somebody try that, to go to 90 minutes.
Well, and also you'd have one theater instead of two. You'd have
one theater instead of two, exactly.
A little bigger writing staff. You'd have one executive producer that you're paying a lot of money instead of two. I mean, it does make sense. And I was talking about this with somebody that just we're using the same model for late night shows that we used in the 1970s, and that model includes having a musical act come on in the end. And when I was watching Letterman every night in 1984, and the musical act came on, this was my only chance to see that musical act unless they were on MTV or with Friday Night Videos at some point. But it was like I didn't have any other options to see these people. So if Dire Straits was on Letterman, this is a big deal. It's Dire Straits. I'm not going to see these guys unless they have an MTV video or they're coming to my town to play a concert. And now it's like if there's a band out there, I can see them on YouTube. So I almost wonder if we need musical acts on late night shows anymore.
I think they only do it because at that point of the show they think the audience is diminished anyway, and they don't have anything else to do.
Right.
I mean, the amount of material this thing chews up is so extraordinary that if you can get 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes filled by music, that's a break.
But isn't that flawed thinking though? I mean, it's like, all right, well, our audience is diminishing anyway these last 15 minutes, and so what the hell, we'll put music on. Like, that seems like a weird way to spend an hour of television.
It is, and you're right. It's kind of like too much now structured and built in and grandfathered in, so to speak, that this is the way you have to do it. By the way, it doesn't do the show behind you any favors at all.
No.
Because you're basically inviting the audience to check out for the last segment of the show. I think that's a really good point, and I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's certainly true that the music act does not draw anybody. I mean, if you talk to any of the bookers on these shows, there's almost nobody if you put Springsteen on, you might get somebody or something. You might a huge act like that, but basically all these acts come on, and it's for the audience in the theater likes it. They like it. They like to get a music performance too.
So if you had to guess, do you think late night shows are going to 30 minutes or an hour and a half, or it's just going to keep going the way it is?
Well, I do think there are people talking about this Stewart and Colbert model, but since you now have, if you're CBS or NBC, you'd need 4 half hours to fill that time period. So nobody really wants to do that. So if I was looking at it, I'd look seriously at the 90-minute format with a young, hot talent, and it certainly wouldn't have Jay and Dave doing it. I would look for a young, hot talent, and at this point, I think the guy to look for is Colbert. Because Colbert is, tremendous talent, and he's locked in there behind John. John's not going anywhere. I think Colbert's ambitious. I think he wants to be a bigger star, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him make the leap.
And he has that history of, he did a lot of acting, and he was in like those different acting troupes, all that stuff.
Yeah,
it seems like a logical progression.
A lot of sketch characters, the way Johnny Carson used to do sketch characters. I can see him doing that kind of stuff. I think he's a guy to look for. I mean, if you look at the other guys, I mean, I think nobody thinks Fallon is ready to move up. Unless there's another talent out there. But I personally think 90 minutes at this point makes financial sense. I don't know if it makes program sense because, again, unless the show is really interesting in the second half, you're going to dwindle away. I mean, it's certainly the way did you ever watch Johnny Carson when he was 90 minutes?
Yes.
I mean, the second half of that show was really, weak soup.
And the guests always seemed like they were a little bit drunk.
Drunk. They were obscure, really obscure. Yeah. Bring in some obscure author or something. Really, and everybody was sitting around smoking. It was like your parents' party when it was falling apart or something.
Right. Well, we didn't know any better. It was the 70s. Let's talk about Conan, because we're taping this on a Tuesday, but his show premiered last night, and people seemed a little bit surprised that the number was that high. I wasn't surprised, because I think the curiosity factor, I thought it would get to 4 million or whatever it ended up with.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised either, because I think even though the mainstream audience did not see that many promos of him unless they're baseball fans, and a lot of people said to me, I think he's kind of coming on below the radar. And this guy worked social media like crazy, and his core group turned out for him, because the median age for his first show was 30 years old.
Right.
That is an incredibly young audience. So he's pulling in really, really young people, and they rallied around him after that episode with NBC, and they were going to support him on the first night, and they'll support him in the first week. The challenge is going to be, what is he doing in 6 months when he has Jon Stewart every night going against him? I think it'll be interesting to see what he can do. I think he'll probably be okay. I don't think he's going to be a threat to Letterman or Leno in terms of his overall viewers.
Yeah, my fear would be, if I was on the Conan camp, that first of all, you have a lot of people who watched last night or who might watch for a couple nights who like Conan but won't go out of their way to watch him every night. And it's very easy to forget about somebody if they're on a channel that's not in your face all the time. And you can just, within 3-4 months, is he just going to be on an island over there? But the funny thing is, if he's getting 1 million viewers a night, isn't that a success for them?
Oh, no question.
Right.
If TBS, this guy comes on and does 1 million plus, a little over 1 million a night, they will make money to begin with, A, and B, they'll have a signature star. They don't have any. What is TBS associated with? They joke and they say it's the Braves and Andy of Mayberry. That's their image. Now they've changed. Now they're associated with repeats. They have repeats of comedies. That's what they run all the time. Well, that's not. There's no brand to that. That doesn't exist as a separate entity. The comedies belong somewhere else, and this is a repeat. I have a funny story in the book. When Conan first met with TBS,
yeah,
he was thinking that Fox was the only place he could go, and they had completely forgotten that they had a meeting with the head of TBS. Literally, they'd totally forgotten it. And they got a call that said, oh my gosh, and they had to go over and have this meeting. And to Steve Coonan's credit, the head of TBS, he pitched very well, and they came out of the meeting kind of impressed, thinking, well, this is a possibility. Maybe we should think about it. And they're sitting around Conan's agent's office, and they said, well, what do we know about TBS? What do they have on? Oh, I don't know. Let's put it on. Let's turn it on, and we'll see what's on right at this very moment. And one guy says, okay, what channel is it on? Well, I don't know. Do you know? I don't know. No one in the room has any clue what channel it's on, and they call in the assistant, and the assistant comes in. He has no idea what channel it's on. And that was a very telling thing to me. TBS has no profile.
And I would argue that it was a borderline genius move to pay whatever they paid for him. Like whatever he commanded, it was worth it, because they have a face now, as you're saying. Like,
yes. But I don't think they paid that much for him. I also think they didn't pay that much for him. I think they got him at a bargain basement price, because the guy had no options. He had no options. Listen, one thing that happened, which I also pointed out in the book, that's kind of not been really picked up on, is that Fox pulled themselves out of the running for Conan a week before he signed with TBS, and Conan's agents asked the Fox guys, please don't go public with this. We'll lose all our leverage.
And where was Comedy Central during all this? Because I always thought the natural home for him was going to be midnight on Comedy Central after Stewart and Colbert.
They gave that maybe cursory thought, and it was clear to them that Conan would not in any way countenance playing midnight on Comedy Central after he walked away from midnight on NBC. He refused to take midnight on NBC. He wasn't going to take midnight on Comedy Central, especially after two other guys that he considers, no worse than his peers.
Right. So this worked out. I have a couple Conan points I want to throw them at you. Number one, not nearly enough. This whole thing where he's a victim and he's still playing this up, and he even played it up in his show yesterday, like NBC did something egregiously wrong to him. You know who did something egregiously wrong to him? His agents, who didn't guarantee the 11:30 time slot into his NBC thing. Like, how does he still have those agents after they screwed that up?
I got to tell you, that has surprised me ever since. They somehow presented it to Conan as though NBC was making something up out of this that really was illegitimate, and they certainly were going to win in court if this ever came to court. But why would it have to go to court? If every other late-night host of any consequence has time period guarantee, including Stewart, Jimmy, Kimmel, Letterman, Leno, they all have time period guarantee. Why didn't he? It was an oversight, and it made it possible for NBC to come in to a meeting and tell him we were going to move you to 12:05. They could not have done that if the contract said, he has time period protection. They couldn't have come up with that plan. It would have been impossible. So he did leave himself vulnerable with that decision, and I can't believe nobody has been called on the carpet for this. Nobody's been, as far as I can tell, in the Conan camp has had to answer for that, and it was a very bad decision.
Okay, that leads me to point number 2. His Tonight Show wasn't good. And, they can be spun any direction that people want, but people weren't watching it because he wasn't acting like Conan. He was acting like this muted, uncomfortable, unsure, I'm in L.A., I don't know what to make of this, and it just wasn't a good show. And now that's been forgotten.
You wrote a terrific blog to that point.
Thank you.
At the time. You wrote a terrific piece, and I almost used some of it in the book. In fact, I had some of it in the book at one point. Because that was your point. Your point was Conan has only himself to blame. He didn't do a good enough show.
Yeah, and to blame the whole, the ratings in front of me weren't good and all that. Well, who's on before Jon Stewart some nights? Like, in this day and age, it doesn't really totally matter who your lead-in is if you have a good show. People are going to find it. And
I think it was a factor, but I think he was already trailing Dave before Jay came on the air. Look, I like Conan, and I think he was off his game a bit. I don't think he was terrible, but I think he was off his game a bit, and partly because he was trying to please NBC in some way, trying to be broader, stretch out his monologue. He didn't seem quite as inventive and creative, and certainly not as highly energized as he was prior to that. But the other thing I would say about Conan is he's a really, really smart guy, as you can imagine, and I think he might have found it if he was left alone. In other words, if they had no choice. If they had let Leno go to ABC and all they had was Conan, he would have probably hung in there and maybe found it and turned it around. Because I think he's a smart guy. But I do think he was not fully on his game when he did the Tonight Show. And it was surprising to me that he thought he was. He didn't sense that he wasn't quite clicking. Even last night when I watched him, I thought, well, this is the old Conan. This Conan, we didn't see this guy much on the Tonight Show, except for the last 2 weeks. We didn't see that guy.
And that leads to point number 3, which is that NBC's biggest mistake in retrospect was just not taking him off the air. They gave him an extra 3 weeks to kind of find his sea legs, and at that point his confidence had been so battered, and then he kind of found himself during those last 2 weeks of shows, and then that carried over to the summer and all the social media stuff he did. And, in effect, they created a competitor to themselves just by not pulling him off.
That's a really good point. If they had pulled him off and he hadn't had those last 2 weeks, I wonder if that whole Team Coco thing would have started.
No, it wouldn't have.
Because he fed that by coming on the air every night and having, rallies outside his studio. And, yeah, I think that really was important that he was able to do that and show, again, why these fans liked him, because I think his last 2 weeks had a lot of good stuff in it. But I don't know that NBC was necessarily are they such bad guys they wanted to just bury this guy? I don't know if they really wanted to do that.
Yeah, but you don't want somebody on your network who's making jokes about you every night that you're getting rid of anyway.
No, it did surprise me in some ways that they kind of let that happen. And they were in the background. Part of the negotiations at the last minute was, what he could say and not say on the air, what guests he could book. They were saying you can't book Howard Stern, for example, and you can't say, you can't disparage Jay on the air. But, he was blowing up NBC every night on the air and getting huge reaction for it. So you're right. I think it was a kind of a curious move, and they made it possible for him. It was like Dunkirk. He got his army into England before they were wiped out.
Right. And then point number 4. It's kind of hard for me to accept the victim thing when he got a $32 million balloon payment to get out of there and now got another good deal on TBS and he's in a great situation. He's the face of their network. I don't feel like he's a victim.
Well, I know for some people, when he comes on the air and complains about what happened to him, they think he is whining and he sounds like a victim. I don't know. I think in some ways he has to use that material now because that is what he's known for at the moment. I think he needs to get off it fast. He needs to get off it now. But I do think this guy, despite the money, I mean, Letterman has all the money in the world, for God's sake, and he's still scarred by what happened to him with NBC. This is a guy who thought he'd gotten to the mountaintop, which he'd pursued for at least 5 years, longer than that, and given up other jobs to get, and really thought he was going to be, the man on NBC. And, he was publicly kind of humiliated by someone saying, no, you're not good enough, you're failing, and we're getting rid of you. And I think it was psychologically debilitating. I know that when I talked to him, which was only, maybe 6 weeks after all these events, the guy was really a wreck. You could see he was really, really feeling it. Now, it certainly lasted, and he's still, doing it. I mean, I know people went to his stage show, said he's doing too much victimization. And I do think he needs to get past it. I hope he doesn't continue it. I really think that would be a big mistake.
Well, you make a great point in the book, and it's something I hadn't really thought about. I do think the psychological effects of, in 2004, he's at the peak of his powers. And, if Fox is coming after him, he's got possibly ABC. The world is his oyster. And NBC plays on his loyalty card. He's the Irish Catholic from Massachusetts. I know a million people like this. And, I want to stay. I owe it to them. All right, I'll wait 5 years, and then I'll take over the Tonight Show, which, in retrospect, was a horrible decision. I mean, really, just horrible, because he gave up 5 years of leverage and opened the door that something terrible might happen, and something did. And I think out of anything, he's probably mad at himself that he was that stupid. Does that make sense?
Well, I do. I totally get that, and I think he although he says to me and to others, I refuse to accept that I should have done it a different way because, I got 5 more years on late night where I was doing great work and I really liked that, et cetera. He could have gone to Fox at that point and become, a total alternative choice because he would have, I think, been appropriate for Fox and, carved out his own identity there. And who knows, at the end of Jay's run, he could have gotten the Tonight Show anyway. They could have said, well, Conan's a hot guy, let's go back after him. I do think that if he really gets, quiet moments and thinks about his decisions, that will be one he regrets. I know that many of the supporters feel that way. They feel like he blew it when he didn't go to Fox. When they offered him $21 million, he was making $8 million. Making $8 million. He stayed at NBC for like $8.5 million, and it didn't go for $21 million, just because he wanted the institution again. The Tonight Show was so big a deal to him.
Well, reading the book, that was one thing that struck me, was that this is a guy who's just gotten bad advice, and the people that ran his life did him a disservice, especially with not having that time slot guarantee. The other thing that came across is I really liked him more after I read the book, and you make this point again and again. He's just an honorable guy, and the way NBC treated him, his fundamental problem with it was that it wasn't honorable, and it really offended him as a human being, which I feel like if I had been in the same position, and, I've criticized him for whining about, not wanting to go to 1205 and be the victim, but I feel like I would have done the exact same thing that he did. I just would have been mad.
Yeah,
so
I think that was a big, big part of it. This is a guy who stepped up for NBC every time they asked him to do it. They really, and hung in there with them, and devoted his whole career to that network. And then when push came to shove, after promising him something, they yanked it away. There was a whole lot of that. I can't abide this. That was really the essence of his manifesto. I'm just not going to accept this. This is an unacceptable thing you've done to me. I can't do it. I can't bring myself to do it.
Well, your last book, Late Shift, it had the great image, which was captured really well in the movie, of Leno hiding in the closet to overhear the Burbank executives talk about his future. This book didn't totally have a crazy anecdote like that, but I thought here was my favorite part, of just weirdness. When they met with Conan, they asked him to possibly move to 1205, and he just said to them, "What does Jay have on you? What does this guy have on you people? What the hell is it about Jay?" And I just imagine like that being said in a meeting must have been so surreal.
It was, and that was the impression that the other guys had. They were like, "Whoa, this is coming from a deep, deep place in this guy."
Yeah.
Because he swallowed for years, what he actually thought about Jay. I mean, the other people around Conan would say, he's kind of a hack. Why don't they push him off the stage? And all that. But Conan was very circumspect and say, "Look, I can't say he doesn't deserve to be on there. He's earning his way. He's getting great ratings, and he's always been good to me. He puts me on the show." He said everything positive. But, in his gut, I'm sure he agreed with the people around him. And here it was. First they put him on at 10 o'clock, jump ahead of him again, and then they, force him to go to 12:05 because they're bringing Jay. It just exploded, this time bomb in him, and he just let it all out there. And it was so interesting that when he let that amount of venom out, it scared the NBC people enough that they told Jay not to call him.
Right.
When Jay said, let me call Conan, maybe we can, talk this through. And they said, no, don't call him, because they had just seen this explosion out of Conan, and they didn't know what would happen in that conversation.
The second thing that amazed me in the book was that Letterman, the fact that he needs a sugar rush before he does the show every night, and he piles Hershey bars. Why don't you tell the story?
Well, this was interesting to me because this is not a story I heard before, but it's apparently always been true, that he stokes himself up before the show. First, he drinks incredible amounts of coffee, so he's really wildly stimulated. But then he sits down, and right before he goes on the show, he unwraps, let's say, 4 Hershey bars. And, of course, Hershey bars are in those little squares. And he breaks the squares up, and he builds a tower. This is a huge tower of Hershey bars. And then he wolfs them down one by one right before he goes on the air. And so when he hits the air, the guy is flying on sugar, absolutely flying on sugar. And I had to think to myself, maybe this is why he had a heart problem.
Yeah, seriously.
Really stoked, this guy. Now, I think he's cut back on this in recent years, but occasionally I've heard him on the air, and I hadn't noticed it before I knew this anecdote. He will occasionally say, "There's nothing better than a Hershey bar."
Wow. Well, I mean, I guess it's a little better than doing cocaine, but it's kind of in the ballpark.
Better, but it's probably not healthy.
Jeez. And then the third thing that I was really surprised by in the book was how vociferously Seinfeld defended Leno.
Well, they're old buddies for sure. They kind of went through the comedy clubs together, and I think Jerry's a real traditionalist, very, very old-fashioned show business guy, and I think he felt like I know he said it to me. He said, you don't take the number one guy off the air. You don't do it. He said, now, look, I took myself off the air. He said, when I canceled my show, that's one thing. He said, but, you don't go to a guy who's number one and tell him, that's it, you're off the air. Who does that?
Yeah.
He really felt that, and I think he felt this sort of youth movement thing was against the old-time comics, and he put himself in that category, that, he's an older comic now, and, Conan's, stirring the young masses against them. He also resented the notion that Jay had done something overtly bad to Conan, because he said, well, we're in show business. This is what we do. We're supposed to look for the best jobs. We're supposed to get them. We're supposed to pursue them. And it's not wrong. It's not right, really, for Jay to walk off the stage and say, it's all yours, Conan. Go ahead, take it. You just don't do that in show business.
The book doesn't have a villain like Jay Leno's manager in The Late Shift, but I think Jeff Zucker's pretty close, right?
He is, because he was the active, the active executive who made the decisions. I don't use the word villain because I don't think he had an evil intent. I really don't. I mean, Helen Kushnick hated Carson and was just undermining him constantly and really pulling stuff that, a good person wouldn't do. I think Zucker would still think of himself as a good person. He just made a decision 5 years ago, and everything he did after that was to protect himself against that decision looking bad.
What's interesting? That happens with sports GMs sometimes. They'll make one terrible trade or one bad signing, and then the next 5 decisions all relate to them trying to protect that bad signing, and that's when they get fired.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, in this case, he has a 5-year plan. As it's coming to an end, he's realizing, oh my gosh, Leno's going to leave. He's going to beat Conan's brains in. I can't have that happen. Let me figure out a way that I don't have that land on me for making this decision 5 years ago. So that means I got to keep Jay somehow. But keeping Jay, he sets up a system where Jay is going to be embarrassed and fail, and he's going to undermine Conan at the same time.
Right.
You know, his big flaw to me was his refusal to make a decision. Pick one guy. Because if he decided after the 5 years it's not really fair to take Jay off, he's number one, then he should have paid Conan off. Pay him off. Say, we made a mistake. We thought Jay would be fading. He's not fading. We owe you this $45 million, and, you know, good luck. And go where you have to go. But at that point, I don't think GE had enough, you know, going that they were going to let him pay $45 million anyway. But
well, wasn't
that was
it
a decision to make? That was a decision to make. If you don't believe in Conan, keep Jay and let Conan go.
Didn't NBC kind of do that 20 years before with Letterman and Leno? They picked Leno, and then they should have known Letterman wasn't going to be happy at 12:30 the rest of his life.
I know. They had him for another year on the contract, and they thought, well, we'll figure it out. We'll make some sort of a seamless late night. They kept saying, because at that point, CBS had just failed with Pat Sajak
right.
as a late night host, which was a crazy choice. In retrospect, now you can't believe they made that choice. But they used that as ammunition. Oh, you can't go create another show. It'll never work. Look how bad they are. It'll never work. It's a dumb idea. And, you know, they were hoping that he would say, yeah, I guess I belong on NBC. And, you know, they didn't know Dave. If you know Dave, that was pointless to think he was going to be able to stay after Jay Leno. He would never have stayed there after Jay Leno.
I have a serious question for you. In sports, we have a lot of bad GMs, and thank God. Because, you know, they make my column 20% better.
It's fodder for you, yeah.
Yeah, and I thank my lucky stars every day that there are people like David Kahn and Billy King that keep getting rehired. In television, or at least in sports, there are good GMs too. Like in the NBA, like Sam Presti's good. The guys who run the Spurs are good. Like there's people you can point to. In television, are there even those people? Is everybody just terrible?
Well, I think you do have to give some credit to Moonves at CBS at this point.
Okay.
They have no business, really, being as consistently successful as they've been over the past 6, 7, 8 years. He has a formula. It's not very creative or artistic. It's very formulaic, but he manages every year to find 2 or 3 shows that are successful and stay on the air. And I think he can be a difficult guy to work for. He does a lot of yelling and all that, but you have to give him credit. He's really done a job there. You know, when Dave saw CBS collapse after he was there for a few years, he was just absolutely enraged. And then Moonves came along and struggled for a while, but Moonves said, "I will fix 10 o'clock. I will fix that for you. I will help you." And he did. He put on CSI and all these shows. And he fixed 10 o'clock, and Dave has had nothing but praise for him since, or at least respect, because he's been consistently good. I mean, the guy is consistently good as a program. He has a good gut for a certain mainstream kind of show, and he's very good at casting because he used to be an actor. So he has real skills. I mean, I don't know that he's done a great job as a CEO, but he's kept CBS in profits with no cable network, so that he's done well there, too. I think, in general, you have to say he's an anomaly in the television business, because he's had a very good track record.
So he's number one. Who's number 2?
Well, number 2.
The guy who runs AMC? Because he's like 3 for 3 with shows.
That guy's as hot as a pistol.
Yeah.
That guy is really hot right now. He is really hot because every show he's put on seems to work.
Yeah.
Now, they're doing only one a year. It's a little easier picking one than picking 6 or 8. But, he's a hot property, and it will be interesting to see if somebody tries to pull that guy away, because he's done a very good job at AMC. I was going to say, Comedy Central's done pretty well, although I guess they haven't come up with that many good primetime shows. I guess this Tosh show is done very well, although it's not a show I can watch.
I like Tosh.
Okay, well,
yeah, I'm a fan.
They've done a few shows, but so they've done a pretty decent job. The woman who runs USA Network, named Bonnie Hammer, they're also good at their formulaic shows. Every year they put on kind of the same kind of Burn Notice, those kinds of shows.
It's always a spy who's either the spy is good looking or his girlfriend is, or there's always a good looking woman and people are running.
Yeah, that's basically the plot. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as she said, it's all blue sky shows. They don't have any dark shows. It's all, optimistic shows, psych shows like this. But they do that well. They have a formula, and it's worked pretty well. But it's a niche. You don't have to have this broad range of shows. I at this point, I don't see a guy that's automatically on the horizon. It's interesting because it looks like NBC's about to hire a guy named Greenblatt, Bob Greenblatt, and he is a guy who just came out of Showtime, where he put on some pretty good shows like Dexter and shows like that. And so it'll be interesting to see what he can do at NBC.
NBC still a major network in 3 years?
Not unless they find something fast.
What's the worst case scenario for NBC?
The affiliates start programming 10 o'clock, and they don't have a 10 o'clock hour.
Oh, like Fox?
Yes, they become Fox. Because right now, the affiliates, they revolted because they had Jay at 10 o'clock. And they basically said this is unacceptable. And they basically threw Jay off the air. Well, what they've put in place is doing worse than Jay. Worse. So I could see them having the same kind of reaction at some point, maybe not this year, but if they don't get it fixed by next fall, where they say, this show on Wednesday night is a bomb. I'm putting on my news. I'm moving my news up. I'm going to have my news at 10 o'clock because I can make money there.
Well, I got to ask you, though. Hold on. Doesn't the Fox model work?
It works for Fox.
They make money, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no. Fox put American Idol on, too.
Well,
yeah, but it has some limitations because they've really struggled to find any kind of half-hour comedy show because they only have those 2 hours. Their half hours are all animated shows on Sunday night. There's not a lot you can do there because you can't build a comedy night very easily that way. I do think at this point, it's a much sounder model because there's no way to find this many programs that work anymore. Between the DVR and all the choices, I just don't think you can realistically find a schedule across the board that works. CBS is coming close. They're coming close. They don't have a lot of disasters on the schedule, but all the others have big, big disasters, including Fox. They had a show on this year, Lone Star. It was
2 episodes.
Ridiculously bad.
Yeah. I really like what Turner, their approach to everything has been with basically turning those channels into a comedy and a drama channel, but then the way they've gone after sports, and they've gone after big assets. Like they have the baseball playoffs. They have basketball. Now they're going to be involved in March Madness. They have Conan. I like that way of playing it. It's almost like if you're building a sports team and you're going after the 4 big assets and then you're just trying to surround them with role players. It's kind of what they're doing, right?
Yes, it is. And they're lucky because as a cable network, they have a revenue stream that they can do that. A lot of people think they're going to get taken to the cleaners on their NCAA deal. But for them, that doesn't matter so much because they're giving these networks an identity. And you can build off that. I mean, the baseball playoffs being on TBS, I think if they didn't have the baseball playoffs, they couldn't possibly have gotten Conan.
I agree. And maybe financially, maybe it didn't make that much sense to do the March Madness thing, but it raises their profile. It makes them more of a signature channel, and eventually it'll lead to them getting more cable costs and being able to, bump up a quarter or 35 cents, whatever they need to do.
Exactly.
I just think it's smart. It's
How well do you think they do sports?
I think that their NBA stuff is fantastic. Baseball wasn't as good. The March Madness, I think, will be good because they're using a lot of the same NBA people.
Yeah.
And also, the football contract, I'm not sure when that's coming up, but that could be a pretty big power player at some point for one of these networks because the football ratings keep going up. Like, you think football can't get more popular, it gets more popular.
Football is tremendously hot. And I think you're right that if you're a TBS looking at the future, that might be someplace for you to try to go after because as the networks lose their economic base, they're not going to be able to pay this prohibitive cost for football. If you're the NFL, the property is even more valuable.
Yeah, and and that's why it goes back to the low assets thing. And Conan's an asset, and we saw it last night. I don't think he's going to maintain the 4.2, but I think he'll be somewhere between 1.0 and 1.5, and that's a huge win for them. If they can get 1.5 1.4 million viewers a night. I don't even know what was Lopez was on before that.
Yeah, Lopez was on.
Yeah, I mean, come on, that's a great job.
No, it's enormous for TBS. If he maintains, anything, above a 1.5 million audience a night, I think it really puts them more on the map. And look, right now, most people who think about TBS would only think about, well, I guess I sometimes watch Family Guy repeats on there.
Yeah.
There's no really individual or original program. I guess they had put this show called My Boys on for example.
Yeah, they had a couple. Yeah, forget about it.
Right, but nobody really talked about it. It wasn't a highly identified show. So I really do think having a guy like Conan gives them so much more, flash, I guess is the right word, in the marketplace. It certainly drew really high-class advertisers. I mean, they had really, really top-shelf advertisers in that show. And, God, they got their money's worth.
And very smartly marketed with social media. Probably the best anybody's ever done.
And I don't think that was TBS, but
yeah.
But I think they took advantage of having a young guy, and they've now a young network because they're, the shows they have on do extremely well with young viewers. They like those repeats.
Well, Bill Carter, you're a lucky man because I think you started working on this book before everything blew up last year, correct?
You are correct, Bill.
So you're sitting there going, yes, fight, everybody fight.
When that started to blow up, of course I reacted that way, and I'm like, boy, this is going to get great for me. And I can't tell you how many other people in the business and other reporters said to me, God, can you believe what you just fell into?
Right.
And it was great. Now, of course, I had to make sure these guys would tell me what went on. But fortunately, I had relationships with virtually all of them already, so I was well fixed to step in and get them to talk to me.
Yeah, I actually said to Kimmel as this whole thing was self-combusting, man, Bill Carter should do a book about this. He's like, he's already working on it. Like he's laughing, this just fell into your lap. It's a really good book. I urge people to get it. It's called The War for Late Night, and I guess it's the natural successor to the other one, right? We could say that.
Yeah, when I was first thinking of titles, the one that people kept throwing at me was The Late Shaft.
I like that.
Which was a clever title, but I would have had to then prove that somebody was shafted, and I found it, as you noted, I'm not sure that that's a fair assessment.
Right, I agree with you. All right, good luck, and we can also read you in the New York Times on the art section. You're writing about TV and business all the time, so
that's
good
right,
luck.
Bill. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. It was fun. Thank you.
So I get to sign off. Whoa!
Thank you for downloading the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Too much fun.
Check out more podcasts at the iTunes Music Store or at Podcenter at ESPNRadio.com.
Peace out.
We wrap up the BS Report with this final thought. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, so build a better one at Subway with tasty choices like the delicious 250 combo, a 16-ounce cup of freshly brewed Seattle's best coffee, and any scrumptious egg muffin melt. That's a lot of breakfast for a little coin. And for a limited time, come in before 11 a.m. for the two newest $5 footlong breakfast subs, the hunger-busting steak, egg, and cheese, or the new Sunrise Subway Melt, just $5. Only at Subway. Subway. Eat fresh.